see all of you tonight. Josh, where's Josh? She came up and asked me, was I just coming back from the Vatican or going? I said, well, I'm just coming back, but I'm so honored to be here tonight, and apologize for being late just a little bit. Reverend Della and myself, we took the same train my friend over here took, trying to get in, and but you know, I'm of the opinion now, it's good to be anywhere, particularly alive, in times like these. So I'm just thankful. Might I say Sister Peggy? Where is Sister Peggy? Can I say that? Is that all right? All right, Sister Peggy. You know I'm from the South now. Okay. So Sister Peggy, let's give it up for all of us. You've been so gracious. I had a speech plan. And then I was around some people today that again changed my life and reminded me that with repairers of the breach that I lead in the Poor People's Campaign, the entire goal of it is to build a stage to put a face on the pain and the realities of our society in order to shift the heart and the consciousness of the nation. So I sat it aside, it's actually right here, and on the train made some notes and had them written off. And I want to really tell you who I'm here tonight on the behalf of. So I showed that video. I really want to, we should say down south, move me out of the way. And I want to use your eyes, your ears, and turn them into eyes. And cause you to see in a way that might say, what can I do to be a part of the movement? Notice I didn't say an organization. Notice the Poor People's Campaign National Call for Moral Revival is not an organization. Josh and I talk about this all the time, it's a movement. And I don't know if it is the movement that will sow the seeds to the change that will take place when I'm dead and gone, or if it's the movement building on all the seeds that were sown before I got here, because I do not live in a state of delusion to suggest we're the first ones to stand up for what's right. But either way, I believe there are some things now that if we're not engaged in them, what's the point of even breathing? A few months ago, I was wrestling with the question, as a preacher, as a theologian, as a pastor, why am I still alive? I know I've been around somebody who's had COVID. I had at least one family that lost 12 members in my church from COVID, 12 family members. One young girl, 18 years old, from Mississippi, lost 25 family members in a 30-mile radius. All of her uncles, aunts, grandma, they're gone in less than 2 years. And I was wrestling with that question, why am I still alive? And one night, as I was musing, that I do sometimes, trying to imitate one of my heroes, Howard Thurman, and was thinking deeply and having conversation with Harriet Tubman in my mystic way. It dawned on me, that's the wrong question to ask about why am I still alive? Because you'll never really, there's no rhyme or reason to that. We say in the church, we face danger seen and unseen. You don't know how many times you have faced death in your lifetime. But in that moment of musing, the question became, what are you going to do with your life since you're still living? And it said, you know, the truth of the matter is, I've talked to doctors, all of us are about 6 minutes from being out of here. If anybody forces you to hold your breath, unless you're one of those great divers that can dive and hold your breath 15 minutes, that's about all you get, 6 minutes. And maybe the question, in a time when breath has become such a commodity, time of COVID, breath. That the question is not why am I here, but what am I going to do with my 6 minutes, my 6 hours, my 6 days, my 6 weeks, my 6 months, my 6 years, or my 60 years? Because if COVID has not taught us anything, we don't have any breath to waste. Physically, politically, socially. We just don't have breath to waste, and we don't have time to be using our breath for the wrong thing. And so I'm here tonight trying to use my breath to lift up. I'm here tonight on behalf of the 32 million people, Peggy, who could literally be out of poverty and low wealth tonight, except for the fact that 2 senators decided to block raising the minimum wage to 15 from being in the COVID relief bill. 2 votes kept 32 million people from working people from being raised out of poverty and low wealth. 2 votes. 2 votes kept 40% of black people from being raised out of poverty. 2 votes. And one of the votes was given while the person was dancing. 2 votes. I've been thinking about that. What kind of world, what kind of philosophy, what kind of life theory wakes you up in the morning and say, let me see how I can use my power to block other folk? But I'm here on behalf of those 32 million people who are the real heroes and sheroes of COVID. Because the story that has not been told, the stats that we've not kept during COVID, is that it hit poor and low wealth people the worst, and poor and low wealth people were the first to go to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick, and the first to die. Because they were the first that we changed their name from service workers before COVID, but then we changed their name to essential workers during COVID. Because somebody had to pack our meat. Somebody had to serve us if we went to a restaurant. So all of a sudden they went from service workers to essential workers. We gave them a name change, but no change in policy. 84% of all the first COVID money, 4% went to corporations. I'm here on behalf of 32 million. I'm here on behalf of some names like Miss Gear, who you saw on that tape, whose child died at her bed, and she was at her bedside because Alabama refused to expand health care. So when you think about the expansion of health care and the 13 states, or I think 13, that have denied health care, the states that need it the most, it's not just a political denial anymore. It literally is a form of government-based murder. In fact, there's a group of us who are clergy now that have asked families, if any of your family members die because the state did not expand health care, and if they had had that health care, they would be alive. If they die and we do the funeral, we're going to have open casket funerals. We want to invite the media in, because I'm not going to stand up there and say God called them home. I can't tell that lie anymore over their bodies. When in fact, it was not God that called them home. It was bad government policy that sent them in the grave. I'm here on behalf tonight of my Shinnecock family, friends, that we still, I'm part Tuscaroran, but the Shinnecock family, who were the original inhabitants of Long Island, that we still have not done right by, that people are still trying to steal their land and their burial grounds. Because if we don't ever talk about getting, repairing and correcting the problem with the first story people, how are we ever going to get the rest of it right? So I'm also here on behalf of the Apache Nation in Oak Flats, where right now there's a multinational company trying to steal their holy ground, their Mount Zion, their national cathedral, their Jerusalem, their Mount Moriah, because they want to drill down and get a little bit of material that's very expensive and will make some folk, they're not even Americans, with a lot of money, but it's going to poison the aquifers from the Apache lands all the way down to other communities. And now the other communities are joining the Apaches, because at first they thought that if they did that on the Apache land, it was just going to poison their land, but they found out their water runs downhill. And guess what's down here? Predominantly white towns. I'm here on behalf of workers in an Alabama plant. As I say when I go preach revival sometimes, y'all don't have to invite me back. Whose owner made a big deal about giving $10 million to civil rights groups during Black Lives Matter uproar, but then 2 days later cut the emergency pay for all the workers in his plant and busted their union down in Alabama, Bezos, and they're suffering. I'm here on their behalf, because I need some of y'all in this room that can talk to folk like that, to start talking to them. What you gonna do with your 6 minutes? Because what profit do you gain the whole world, and you lose your soul and hurt other people in the process? I'm here on behalf of a South Carolina company, Giddy, down in South Carolina, a poor county where the workers, when they started organizing for labor unions, the company hired people to pour manure down on the side of the roads and the streets where they had to walk to go door to door to ask people. Yeah, I see you frown at that. And we don't hear about that, do we? On the CNN and the news. I'm here on behalf of the 52 million voters, not black voters, not alone, but the 52 million voters who use the processes to vote that 49 states are now have bills to undo. I'm gonna talk about it in a minute, but you all do understand, this is what we're dealing with is not Jim Crow. It's not just targeted at black people. And if you're gonna get in the voting rights fight right now, you don't need to get in the voting rights fight to be altruistic toward black people. We better get involved in it to save this democracy. Because these folks are going after the entire progressive voice. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense that you're filing the same voter suppression bill in Texas, which is now majority people of color, that you're filing in West Virginia that hardly has any black people. It's not just a fight to protect the rights of black people. I'm here tonight on behalf of the 65 million poor and low wealth people who now make up possible voters in this country, who make up 30% of the electorate for the first time in the history of America. I'm here on behalf of the 8 women I just left in DC who reminded me by just being in their presence. You know, they went to DC today to say, why are you all still talking about whether it's gonna be 3.5 trillion or 2.5 trillion or 7 trillion, it needs to be 10 trillion. Why are you all not talking about what the plan does and talking about us? Why won't you let us speak? If you're going to have family leave in this bill, why won't you let somebody who needs family leave be at the podium? Let's put a face on this bill, not just numbers. Because the numbers game is a shell game. It's a farce. It doesn't really show what's at stake. And so they said, Reverend Bob, we want to go. Now, let me tell you, Pam Garrison, white coal miner's wife, longtime low-wage worker from West Virginia. Faith Lee, a gig worker at DoorDash from Silver Spring, Maryland. Marcella Ramirez, a produce worker from Philadelphia, immigrant. Emily Johnson, a white woman from Mississippi, low-wage worker who was a victim of human trafficking, and she got out of that, and now she's being pushed down because of the rules in Mississippi, the denial of living wages in Mississippi, denial of health care. Think about that. She survived human trafficking, and now she's being prostituted by government policies. That's what I was with before I came here. Andrea Downing of Lexington, Kentucky, a game day employee at the University of Kentucky, who came up out of a felonious lifestyle and has turned her life around and just wants to be able to go to work as as Carolyn Barker from West Virginia, low-wage worker with a master's degree, said today, I just want to be able to go to work and not have to die to take care of my family. That's all I want. Not have to die from the stress of having a master's degree but having to work a low-wage job and having to search my couch for nickels and quarters to see how to pay my light bill. Or work with women in Appalachia who I know, white women, by the way, who are low-wage workers, who every Tuesday have Taco Tuesday. And I asked them, it's a little tough, but you need to hear it. I asked them, why do y'all have Taco Tuesday? And they said, well, we have Taco Tuesdays and we sell tacos to people driving past one so we can get a pool of money to help each woman with her supplies for her female cycle, because we can't afford it. And we don't want benevolence. We want to make a living wage. I was with Joan Sleed, a home health care worker for over 50 years from Phoenix, Arizona, and she doesn't understand why in the world her senator is voting against her. She said, I love taking care of people. I've taken care of people during COVID. This is my life, this is my heart. Why should I be punished? Because I love helping people in their homes. Why should I have to go and take care of somebody in a $6 million house and I can't even afford health care myself? But I do it because I love it. And I just wonder, does my country love me as much as I love doing this in my country? So I was reminded, I'm here today on behalf of those women. And you know, it's interesting. We sent this press release out all over the media, and the media, I listened to them bemoaning about how divided we are, and we brought 104,000 signatures from poor, low-wealth people and faith leaders across the community, and 4 media outlets showed up. Now, if we had been there fighting or storming the Capitol, right? If it had been just all black women cussing, or if it had been some black and white women fighting, you'd have had every camera there from this side of the Atlantic Ocean. But when you bring a group of folk to show that it is possible, as senators believe, that you can bring people together, they act like that's not a story. I've actually had media people tell us that. They said, we'll get your stories in the morning and then something will come up where somebody's fighting and they'll tell us, report that. So they're more interested in the fight than they are in the healing, right? For media. But most of them said, we'll pass. You have a white woman from Appalachia, from West Virginia, standing with a white woman from Mississippi, standing with a black woman from Arizona, standing with another black woman from Maryland, standing with a Latina. In this climate, and you don't think that's a story? And they're all coming there with one voice to say to President Biden, Pelosi, Manchin, McCarthy, Schumer, all of them, why don't you let us talk? And you don't think that's a story? That means we got a real moral deficit in this country. It's not interested in moral fusion. I contend sometimes there are a lot of folk that are not interested in healing because they make too much money on the divide. But some of us have to decide, how are we going to use our 6 minutes? Are we going to use our breath to just be a part of the continuation of the divide? Or are we going to use our breath to be, as Pope Francis said, to have the character of what it means to be poor in spirit, which means to speak truth to power, to believe in the fraternity of all people, to live out love, to live out charity? Are we going to recognize in this moment that we are in a crisis of civilization, not just a crisis of political parties? We are in a crisis of democracy. And might I just say, it's not just because of January 6th. Might I say, that's not the first time we had an insurrection in this country. Might I say, that's not the first time we saw violent people trying to take over stuff. November 10th, 1898, in the middle of Reconstruction, a Gatling gun was brought into the city of Wilmington, killed 3 to 5% of the city. More people killed per capita than were killed on 9/11. To stop black and white people from working together, November 10th, 1898. And by January 1900, the last African American violently had been forced out of the United States Congress. January the 6th has, as my grandma used to say, has roots. Anybody from South Carolina, down the South? I got any Southern folk in here that own it. Where you from? You heard that before, huh? It has roots. Now the word is roots, but what they meant was, don't think that what you see now just happened. It's just happenstance. Give me a napkin, Joe. The violence we saw on January 6th is connected to a long lineage of social violence that Coretta Scott King talked about. Coretta Scott King was asked one day, she said, somebody asked her, how do you feel about your husband being assassinated and that violence? She said, well, that's just one form of violence. Denying people education is a form of violence. Denying people basic living wage. This is Coretta Scott King talking a few days after her husband was shot, and she refused to locate this country's violence just to what had happened to her husband. She said, what happened to my husband has roots. Roots. This moment we're in is really about whether or not we're going to address, let me see if I can use that in this room, Reverend, the sin, the scandal, and the social crime of poverty and low wealth in our time. Because it is a sin, a scandal, and a crime that there are 140 million poor and low wealth people in America in the 21st century. Poor and low, 140 million poor and low wealth people. Before COVID ever hit, the Columbia Mailman School of Public Policy did a study and said 700 people died a day from COVID. From poverty. 7 people died from vaping, and there was a White House conference, congressional hearings. 700 people, I didn't say black, 700 people died from poverty before COVID. 250,000 people a year. Where's the outrage? And who makes up that 140 million? Well, 66 million of them are white, 26 million are black. Poor whites make up 30% of the white population. Poor blacks make up 60.9% of the black population. So the disparity is in the percentage, but in raw numbers, there are 40 million more poor and low wealth white people than there are black, and most of them are working, and women and disabled. 68% of Latinos are poor and low wealth, 68% of First Nation people, 78 million women, over 50% of our children are poor and low wealth. That's a scandal. In the wealthiest nation in the world. We're actually releasing a letter to the G20 from my meeting at the Vatican last week. Pope and others and myself and economists like Jeffrey Sachs and others are writing a letter about saying to the G20, you know, we can't keep reneging on the promise that was made in 1948. You know what that promise was? That health care, food, water, and living wages were human rights, not desires. That's what we said in the aftermath pain of World War II. But then as the pain subsided, the moral consciousness subsided. And so if this is true and we're in a time of crisis, then this language we're using is too puny, like left versus right. That's so puny. Moderate versus conservative. You know, the great William Lloyd Garrison, who used to walk the streets of New York, he was one of the founders that led to the development of The Nation magazine. He was an abolitionist. And one day somebody said to him, if he was more moderate, he could win over the slaveholders. And he said, well, you go tell a woman whose child is being burned up in a house to be moderate. You go tell a man who's watching his wife being ravished to be moderate. But on the issue of injustice and the lives of the slaves and the future of this democracy, I will not be moderate, I will be heard. So this language, moderate versus conservative, liberal versus conservative, left versus right. What about this category, right versus wrong? And you said, but Reverend Bob, that's so ideal. That's such a so yeah, I know that's ideal, but you know you can't do that. Well, 2,600 years ago, the Jewish prophets did it. When they challenged ancient Israel, whenever ancient Israel did not care for the least of these and forgot that she had been a group of slaves, Isaiah 10 said, woe unto those, this is actually in the scriptures, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. In other words, anytime a policy makes another person prey, it makes the policy person animalistic. Now, I didn't say that. Isaiah said that. But Isaiah's a pretty good reference. 200 years ago, this country was supposed, we said we the people, in order to, what? A more what? More perfect, which was an admittance that it wasn't what? Perfect. So even the founders knew that they had to put some repentance inside of that, because they knew they were wrong. So they put a little repentance in there. Say, in order, as Thurgood Marshall said, the best thing about the Constitution is it could be amended. And the 14th Amendment, which is right in the middle of the amendments, is saved the Constitution. That's what saved it, equal protection under the law. You didn't have the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. How many lawyers are in here? I play one on Tuesday. How many lawyers in here? Am I right? That 14th Amendment is pretty good stuff, isn't it? And it doesn't just apply to citizens, does it? Lawyers, help me. I might be wrong. I don't want to be wrong, loud and wrong. It doesn't say you shall ensure citizens equal protection under the law, does it? It says anybody who exists in these borders by Constitution is ensured equal protection under the right. Everything women have fought for, everything trans people have fought for, everything gay people have fought for, every black people, everything hinges on that legal principle. Without it, the Constitution falls apart. But from the beginning, they said the country was supposed to be founded on this principle, the establishing, to establish benevolence. Nope. To establish the ruling class. Nope. To establish inequality. Nope. To establish liberal politicians, no. To establish moderate politicians, no. To establish conservative politicians, no. To establish justice. Justice. What love looks like in public. Justice. What love looks like in policy. And then the country was supposed to promote the elite, no. Promote the moderate, no. That's an entitlement. You know, sometimes on Tuesdays when I say at least 2 curse words, only on Tuesdays, I want to ask some of these politicians who dare to suggest that something like living wage and health care is an entitlement, what the hell is wrong with you? Really, what in the hell is wrong with you? You swore to promote the general welfare. That's why we're in a crisis of society, civilization, because we're so far from these values. Huh? And this is what should critique every piece of public policy. Not is it liberal, not is it conservative, but does it line up with this? Every time protest movements, justice movements have come together around these principles, these deep religious principles, these deep moral principles, the nation has moved a little closer toward being a more perfect union. When somebody has said, wait a minute, what did we say on paper? What did we claim we really trust in? 54 years ago, Dr. King wrote a little book called Why Can't We Wait? How many of you read that book? You ought to read it. That last book, Why Can't We Wait? I'm just encouraging you to read that book. You can read mine if you want to, but you ought to read Why Can't We Wait? Where do we go from here? Chaos of community. And listen what he said. He said, he looked at the historic denial and exploitation of humiliation of the Negro down through the years, and he said some form of payment is needed to be made. He proposed 40 years ago, this was way back, that America launch a broad-based, gigantic Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, not for black folk, for the disadvantaged. He said, we need a Marshall Plan for the poor and the hurting. He was talking stimulus way back before we were fussing over it in the 21st century. He said this, while Negroes form the vast majority of America's disadvantage in terms of percentage, there are millions of poor whites who would also benefit from this kind of massive, listen to this, bottom-up stimulus. Bottom up. He said the moral justification for the special measures for the Negro is rooted in the robberies of the institution of slavery, but many poor whites were the derivative victims of slavery too. As long as labor was cheapened by involuntary servitude of the black man, the freedom of white labor, especially in the South, was little more than a myth. Then he went on to say, we must develop a federal program of public works, retraining and jobs for all, so that none, white or black or Latino, will have cause to feel threatened. That was King 50 years ago. And we're struggling with a Build Back Better program when Martin told us 50 years ago we should have been doing this. And then he says, together, he says, the truth of the matter is the only coalition that could fundamentally shift America and help it live out what it has said it is for blacks and poor whites and welfare recipients and Latinos and First Nation people. And he even suggested people of wealth with a conscience might be the only coalition that could save this democracy and help it become what it has over and over said it wanted to be, but also had an anemia in practice. Another writer said in a book I was reading, says, we've been talking about this whole economic crisis wrong. The fact of the matter is we've had a silent depression. When in the midst of COVID, we had two public health specialists. My daughter is one of them. She's a public health specialist from Harvard. She's now leading a center at Drexel. And my son is leading an environmental climate issues. He's a physicist and lawyer. They're much smarter than me and mama. And both of them have said what happened in COVID just exposed the fissures of poverty and race. And in this book it said, a political economist from the University of Maryland said, what we are really beginning to experience is in an article called America Beyond Capitalism. Now don't get scared of that. He wasn't talking about, he's trying to make a point here. He said, America Beyond Capitalism, what we're experiencing now is a process of slow decay punctuated by a recurring economic crisis, one in which reforms achieve sporadic gains because we never carry the reforms far enough. We do a little bit, feel good, and we quit. He said, but the long-term trends of growing inequality, economic dislocation, failing democratic accountability, deepening poverty, ecological degradation, greater invasions of liberty, and growing imprisonment, especially of minorities, continues to slowly and quietly challenge the belief in the capacity and the moral integrity of the overall system and its governing elite. And Jeff Sachs and I have been talking about, we do not have a scarcity of resources to deal with poverty and low wealth or scarcity of ideas. We have a scarcity of consciousness. An MIT professor that I studied with a little bit, Otto Schwammer, said there is a blind spot in the American economic theory today. It's called consciousness. Our refusal to have an economic theory that looks and sees that we are all integrated and we all really do need each other. And the big question is, are we going to have a nation where its wealth can be shifted institutionally to benefit the vast majority of the people? Or are we going to isolate it because we cannot isolate it? And what we are finding is that for years we were taught what is good for Wall Street is good for your street and our street, but that no longer holds true even for Wall Street. Because you can't have 140 million people in the base of a pyramid and think that that pyramid is going, that structure is going to survive. It's going to come apart eventually. In fact, that is actually the breeding ground for authoritarian leadership. And so what we see now is rooted in these issues, and what we need is a movement that's rooted in this kind of deep analysis. We've got to build moral fusion coalitions, and I'm through. We've got to build them with people who have the stern resolve, rooted in love for the Creator and love for each other, or love for the moral arc of the universe, that will demand and fight and push for what we call a third Reconstruction. America's had two, but both of them were assassinated. First Reconstruction, 1865 till around 1898, 1899, was killed. But during that period of time, poor whites and blacks and all came together and began to have some fundamental shifting in this country post the Civil War. Then you had the Second Reconstruction around 1954 to about 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King, Kennedy, and others. They never finished. We need a third Reconstruction. It's got to include everybody. It's got to be black and white and brown and Asian and First Nation and young and old and gay and straight and people who are empowered and people with wealth with a consciousness, urban and rural. And that third Reconstruction must ask Joseph Stiglitz's question. I remember sitting with him. He's not in here tonight, is he? But I remember sitting with him one day, and when we started talking about the Poor People's Campaign, because I'm one of these, I don't believe in just having inspiration without information. Worst thing you can do is be loud and wrong. So I sat down with him to talk about this economic stuff, and he said, we're asking the wrong question. The wrong question for the nation is how much will it cost if we do this to fix it. The real question is how much does it cost if we don't? That's the question. And that must be the root of a third Reconstruction. Because what is it costing us now? It's costing us 700 lives a day plus more, 250,000 a year. It's costing the divisions. But also the divisions we see now are not just being created now. What's happening is we're seeing a reconnecting to old divisions, because when you have this level of poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism and Christian nationalism, it causes regrowth. You know, kind of like a lizard's tail growing back together. It causes regrowth. And what's happening is there's a growth that's reconnecting to the old stuff. Neil Painter at Princeton said that what we're seeing now is the iconography of a too often repeated American reality. What we're seeing now, all this division, I just want to tell y'all, Trump wasn't smart enough to think of this. Don't give him that much credit. And if you give him that much credit, you miss, because you think if we just deal with him, then you've dealt with the problem. The truth is, Kevin Phillips in the 1960s advised Richard Nixon that the Republican Party could win without the Negro vote. He said, what you have to do is paint the Democratic Party as the black party. He said that we could have a new American revolution coming out of the South and the Southwest, and if we control the South and the Southwest, we could control the Electoral College. We could control 168 electoral college votes before one vote was cast. We could control 30% of the Senate at any time, 30% of the House at any time. He said, now what we have to do is use the fears and the objections raised by both the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the women's movement. And we use those fears. Buchanan, who was Nixon's aide and Kevin Phillips' colleague, called it positive polarization. Intentional division. These are their words, not mine. I just go to the library. In positive polarization, they figured out then ways to divide the country for political advantage. And Buchanan wrote, he said, if we do this, we can cut the country in half, but we'll always have the bigger half, or at least the 51%. And Howard Dent said to him, do it, but always disavow it publicly. And always blame it on her. You see, Trump didn't start this. He inherited it. And you got to understand where it grows. It grows out of fear. Howard Thurman once said something we should remember when we look at what's going on right now. The measure of a man's estimate of your strength is the kind of weapons he feels that he must use in order to hold you fast in a prescribed place. If somebody fights you hard, it's actually telling you how much power you have. The voter suppression, for instance, that we see is born out of a fear that the demographics have shifted in a way that the masses of poor and low wealth people can form coalitions of power that can shift the economic architecture that Dr. King spoke of at the end of the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. He said the root of voter suppression is the fear of the poor and low wealth Negro and white masses coming together to shift the economic architecture of the nation. That's why the Chamber of Commerce has openly supported blocking voting rights legislation. Yes, they have. That's why there's a lot of money behind blocking both living wages and voter rights and undoing these and giving federal protection. It's not just about color, it's about money. That's why we see these tactics we haven't seen. These tactics are rooted in the right fights that began after the Civil War. I wrote it like this: the Confederates militarized it, the KKK advanced it, Plessy legalized it. It was picked up and continued by Strom Thurmond and Barry Goldwater in 64, continued by George Wallace in 64, 68, and 72. It was made a Southern strategy by Kevin Phillips and Lee Atwater. It was picked up by Ronald Reagan, continued by Pat Buchanan. It was even used by George Bush, and Donald Trump has just charismatized it and pushed it with media savvy and invested in it billions. But it's dangerous because it's unleashed, and it's like a bullet. Once that bullet comes out of the barrel of the gun, the shooter has no control over it anymore. And they're doing it at the very time, Josh, that poor and low wealth people make up 30% of the elected, 65 million, and the sleeping giant in this country are poor and low wealth people. We're releasing a study on Friday that talks about how poor and low wealth people in 2020 election, poor and low wealth income voters accounted for 1/3 of the total electorate and exceeded 20% of the total voting population in 45 states. I won't go through all the stats, but the issue is here, any politician that is ignoring dealing with poverty, systemic poverty, racism, but dealing with poverty, is engaging in a form of, it's constitutionally inconsistent, it's morally indefensible, it's economically insane, and it's politically incompetent. We want to see this country shift. The answer for the shifting is among the poor. You want to see West Virginia change? It's poor and low wealth voters, the ones that oftentimes neither political party talks to or talks about. That's why poor and low wealth people are rising up and organizing today. That is why we are clear of what needs to happen. Because even though we might celebrate, and I don't know where you stand in the election, but I'm just talking the facts. The current president we have, one set of data says he won by more than 7 million votes, but that's the popular vote. The other data says it was only 45,000 cumulative voters in Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona. Only 45,000. And that's why we can't just do physical infrastructure. We got to do the infrastructure of our daily lives, healthcare, living wages, education. But we also have to protect the infrastructure of our democracy. What good is it to have a bridge to go across the water when you've torn apart the bridge that takes you to a greater democracy? And so in the Poor People's Campaign, we have decided that in this moment, we don't need an insurrection. We need a resurrection. We need a resurrection of people coming together around an agenda. And that agenda we have actually put into something called the third Reconstruction, ending poverty, low wages from the bottom up. And we say first thing is we've got to properly count poverty because we got the wrong measurement. Government measurement of poverty doesn't tell you anything about the story. We've got to enact living wages. We've got to protect the right to join unions. We've got to provide universal single-payer health care. We've got to guarantee that everybody has a right to housing and water and equitable and diverse public education. We must relieve debts that cannot be paid, including student debts and housing debt and medical debt. It can't just be those that know how to do bankruptcy can get their debts removed. We've got to expand and protect, not just protect our voting rights, but expand our voting rights. We've got to ensure the rights of indigenous and native people and tribal nations. We've got to establish national commissions on truth and racial justice and transformation. We must enact a comprehensive and just immigration reform that ensures access to legal documentation. We must embrace a climate agenda that prioritizes the poor and those hit first and worst by climate disaster. We must demilitarize our foreign policy and borders, and we must redirect some of our military spending and implement fair taxes. We're arguing about $350 billion a year for 10 years to lift the society, and we don't hear one argument about $750 billion for war every year. That's a moral spiral toward death. And so we gotta have a movement that's rooted in the hope, like Jürgen Moltmann said about hope. He said, really causes not rest but unrest. Real hope doesn't cause patience, it causes impatience. It does not calm the unquieted heart, but it is itself the unquieted heart in man. Those who hope in God no longer put up with reality as it is, but begin to suffer under it and make it different. And this movement we must engage indigenously led people. We must build from the bottom up. We must put a face on the movement. We must use moral language that's strong enough to speak to the pain of our moment. We must demonstrate some type of commitment to civil disobedience to drive home how serious things are. We must build a stage from which to lift the voices of everyday pieces. We must We must recognize the centrality of racism and race. We must build a broad, diverse coalition, including moral and religious leaders. We must intentionally diversify the movement with the goal of winning unlikely allies. That's why the Poor People's Campaign is in Appalachia, just like we're in Alabama. We got to bring folk together. We got to build transformative, long-term coalitions and relationships around an agenda. We have to make a serious commitment to academic and empirical analysis. Do you know a lie that they keep telling that poor white people vote against their own self-interest? That's not empirically true. The data actually says when poor white people vote, they actually vote more progressive. The problem is most of them don't vote. And why? Well, we did the study with Columbia University, and it says the reason is because nobody talks to them. Nobody goes to Eastern Kentucky. Politicians have washed their hands of them. The very people connected with black people and brown people that could transform the political realities in this country. We have to engage in massive voter registration. We've got to pursue a long legal strategy. We can't give up on the Constitution. We've got to learn how to sing this movement, and we've got to resist the one moment mentality. And so I came today representing all those folk, and I came, Peggy, to ask all of you to help us do one thing, regardless of how BBB happens or what happens in the next few days. June 18, 2022, we've decided that there needs to be a generationally transformative gathering of poor and low-wealth people from across this nation. Not a march, not a day, but a declaration. A declaration that we can no longer refuse to address the interlocking injustices of systemic poverty, racism, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative, religious nationalism. But we need the people impacted to speak. And so on June 18th, just a few days before the summer solstice, when the sun is closest to the earth and it shines light, it's time to shine light on this reality and speak to the heart and the conscience of this nation. June 18, 2022, we did it online last year and had 2.7 million people to show up, but that's not good enough. We gotta be in person, all of us, of every race, of every creed, of every color. And I promise you, we will build a stage, not for a person to get up and speak. This is probably the longest you'll ever hear me speak. We want the people. I want Pam to speak. I want Faith. I want Marcia. I want Emily and A. I want the people to force this nation to see them and hear them. And not just hear them, but to hear their policies and their agenda. And to say that the salvation of this nation is already among us. The stones that the builders have rejected can literally become the stones of building a new and stronger democracy. We got to come together. And don't y'all get scared yet. Because you haven't faced anything worse than slavery yet. And yet when Harriet Tubman, a black woman, and Frederick Douglass, a black man, came together with William Lloyd Garrison, a white man, and Lucretia Mott, a Quaker woman, when they came together, they turned slavery around. When black and white workers came together in the labor movement in the late 1900s and built labor movements, they turned the country in a different direction. When Fannie Lou Hamer and white men came together, like the Unitarian that was shot in Selma, and Martin Luther King, and the two white women that sent Rosa Parks to Highlander to learn how to do civil district, when they all got together, along with people like Viola Russo, who was killed 1 hour after the end of when those folk got together, they did more with less. They had less than we had, and yet they did more. And they brought Jim Crow down. Some people thought apartheid would last forever, but when Bishop Tutu got together with Peter Story, and then they got together with the mamas of South Africa, and then when young people from all over the world, white and black, began to get together, they brought apartheid down. And a few years ago, Peggy, when they said I'd never walk again, yeah, I was 30 years old, my doctor said it was over. They said, you might as well get an address for a nursing home. And I went through some depression. I went through some struggle. But then in my church, the prayer warriors got together. And my doctors got together. And my swim coach got together. And my family got together. And when we all got together, we were able to fight back against this disease. And I might have a limp, but it's a long ways from not walking. And I'm telling you that when we get together, it is the only hope for the crisis in culture and crisis in civilization that we have right now. And I come on behalf of all of those who are getting together to say, join us. Maybe the reason God has given you an extra 6 minutes of breath is so you can use it to breathe fresh freedom, fresh democracy, and help resuscitate this hurting country of ours. Maybe the reason you're still living, some of you got gray hair, and you've already had some fights, but maybe you got one more in you. And maybe it's because the Creator trusts that you and I together and all of these other folk are just what the world needs to make it better. God bless you.
Reverend, can you just wait 1 minute? Because we do have something to honor you. Hi, it's so good to see you. And let me introduce you to Monica. She's just on your other side.
So, our scenario goes, use our minds and exercise our brains to solve complex problems of poverty, of injustice. And I feel like in having Reverend Barber come up to the stage and immerse us in his heart and his soul and his mission, it was the perfect way for us to experience who he is, who he represents, what he does in the world, and how fully he encapsulates bridging leadership. And we're here tonight to honor him, to give him the David Rockefeller Bridging Leadership Award, and it's my great pleasure and honor to do so.
There's an ancient drawing like this that kind of favors the Trinity with the circles. Yeah. The interlocking circle of Synergo. So thank you so much. And on behalf of the 47 coordinating committees around the country and now more than 300 partners and over thousands of faith leaders, my co-chair, Reverend Theo Harris. And I want to personally say thank you to Josh and to Monica, because when I sat in his living room a few years ago and had told this crazy dream about the need for a poor people's campaign, and that we first needed to go do moral revivals across the country, he said, And then he invited me back, and he listened some more, and I said, is this man paying any attention to me? I'm not gonna keep coming back here. And he said, And the third time, he starts saying, you know, I know so-and-so, I know this person, I know this person, and he made sure we could at least get a sandwich somewhere. And I said, you know, I thank God for him, because he got it when it was before it was, we had one coordinating committee, and he's been right there, calls, asks how things are going sometimes, and I just appreciate that, Josh, more than you know, because it's not a transactional relationship. You know, I'm not interested in those. I think we are born for such a time as this. And so, Peggy, I'm going to be your friend for life. And I'm coming one day to cook for you, but you can't bring all these people. You can bring 10. So you pick out the best 10, the most needed 10. And we'll do it. But certainly, thank you. And together, we're going to do this work. I would say we're going to die trying, but I would say we're going to live trying. There you go.